Mortal Kombat's Deadly Alliance had a lot to prove. It released in a time where the series was generally seen as being in decline. Even putting bad adaptations of the time aside, MK4 and the Sub-Zero and Jax spin-offs were not seen as particularly great games, and the last of those saw the departure of series co-creator and lead writer John Tobias, along with a lot of other team members, mid-development. So this game was to release during a very low point for the series, with new people guiding the story, which had always been an important part of MK, and people who say different are just stupid, and it was to be the first MK to skip arcades and go straight to consoles, where it would release on 6th generation hardware. And so now, 2 full decades after the game's launch on the 16th of November 2002, let's look back and see if the team at Midway managed to pull it off. We'll start with the presentation. This was the point where the menus became more complex and stylish. This is one of those where the menu is set in a 3D environment that the camera moves around as you switch between sub-menus. It's nice, and a huge improvement over the "this is a port of an arcade game" bare minimum the previous entries had. The music is actually good, even without relying on remixes and new arrangements of older themes, which is sadly not so common these days. It's all new and it's all good. Some, I would argue, are as iconic and memorable as those heard in the classic era. There's not much else to say really, I just like the music, and that character select theme has no right going as hard as it does. This track alone has more personality than most of the music in the NetherRealm era. In terms of model detail, there were fighting games that looked better by this time, but I imagine the need for models to be dismemberable played a factor here. Still, for 2002 it's fine. It's only really an issue in later games. Blood is now more present, not only because there's more of it, but also because it now stains the ground where it falls, and it even rolls down the characters' bodies to reach the floor. And there are bloody footprints left when you stand in it, which I think was the first time I'd ever seen such a system. Pit 2 fighters with different blood colours against each other and play a game of Splatoon with it. It's sick, in both ways. And characters now get bruised and blooded when they get hit to help convey the brutality on display. As for the actual character designs, I think we have some of the best in the series. Maybe it's because a lot of these characters tend to stay closer to a particular style now, but these designs are great, striking a balance between recognisability and doing something new, both for its own sake and to take advantage of not needing to make them easy to reproduce for live actors to wear. This gives us full Lizard Reptile, he actually looks good, shut up loser, Raiden with this sick cape, Jax with more going on than metal arms and a jacket, Sonya in sensible clothing with some personality to it, Kung Lao with his hat on his back instead, and one of his best looks as an alternate, Sub-Zero with a wizened mentor look and ice-coated arms to imply his increased power, Kano with an open jacket to show off his chest without being generically shirtless, Maskless Scorpion finally playable without being recolored grey, cool new characters like the Icicle Herd Frost and Li Mei in this lovely outfit that remains her best, only a couple of nostalgia costumes to avoid being oversaturated with that, and even Shang Tsung as he was depicted in the MK1 prequel comic. Some are letdowns like Su Hao's very similar costumes, and I don't even know what some of the ladies' alternates are meant to be, but Jax's alternate is just hilarious and you're dead inside if you disagree. Good costume selection all around, and some are among my favourites in the series. But what is the context behind some of these outfits? Look, I used up most of my segue energy on the MK2 video, leave me alone. This game is where the plot started to become more complex. 1 and 2 were simple tournaments with the characters split into sides, at least retroactively for MK1. MK3 and 4 were invasion stories with 2 sides and a subplot each. This game has a central conflict that about a third of the cast are not a part of in any way. And the wild part is that one of these subplots here is actually crucial setup for both of the next 2 games, but with entirely independent setups. The story is told across pretty much every area of the game. The intro movie, character bios, character endings, crypt unlockables, and conquest mode. While most fighting game intros of the time were content to just have a series of brief shots of their characters in mostly irrelevant scenarios just to highlight their presence on the roster, Deadly Alliance instead focused on the context behind those characters' appearances here, essentially taking the text screens of the 2D era and making them fully animated with narration by Raiden similar to MK4's intro. And it's still amazing what just a 5-year gap between MK4 and this made for this intro. After a basic explanation of the series' premise over Liu Kang training, we then follow Quan Chi escaping the Netherrealm while evading Scorpion, as per the latter's MK4 ending telling us how the previous game's events led into this one. This is something I like about MK, how it can take what are essentially B-plots and use them to lead into the next plot instead of having everything revolve around a handful of core characters and factions, like Tekken and Dead or Alive, or even the original MK trilogy. And this game will do the same to set up the next 2 entries later. Quan Chi uncovers the mummified army of the Dragon King, who remains an enigmatic and intriguing figure of the MK universe's history for now, and the game will do a lot to hype up his eventual debut as Onaga, making for a very exciting reveal along the lines of the 2008 debut of Hero King Algol in Soul Calibur 4. Anyway, Quan Chi needs necromancy to revive this undefeatable army, so he turns to Shang Tsung, who has been established as a necromancer since he revived Sindel in MK3. Pairing these two characters up makes so much sense. First off, Quan Chi played much the same role in Shinnok's forces as Shang Tsung did in Shao Kahn's, the powerful sorcerer right-hand man who secretly plots to betray his master. They hadn't done much to differentiate the two by this point, making Quan Chi feel like a cheap replacement, but having him join up with his Outworld counterpart almost makes that not matter, at least for this entry, since they're now a duo, so their similarities can complement one another. Second, the two actually had cooperated in the past, as explained in MK Mythology's backstory, where Quan Chi provided Sindel's soul to Shang Tsung in return for the location of the map to the Temple of Elements that he obtained by taking the Great Kung Lao's soul. It honestly feels like this alliance was being set up 5 years prior. And third, a similar premise to this occurred in one episode of the Conquest TV show titled Unholy Alliance. And unlike a later similarity with Conquest, I can believe that the show inspired this. So the two now need to cement themselves as a serious threat. After all, both have already been bested in the past. Shang Tsung was MK1's final boss, then got demoted to playable character as his boss took over as the game boss and lost twice in a row to Liu Kang, while Quan Chi was the penultimate boss of Mythologies and a normal fighter in MK4. If we're to take these two seriously, they need to do something big. And boy do they. First they head to Outworld to meet with Shao Kahn and they kill him. It wasn't clear that Kahn was even alive prior to this, and the whole Reiko may or may not be Shao Kahn debate was still fresh in fans' minds at the time, so this alone isn't enough, especially since this is the boss we've already bested twice. MK2 introducing the boss of the previous game's antagonist, MK3 bringing the fight to Earthrealm, and MK4 introducing a god as a villain were all pretty simple ways to up the scale of the threat. Kahn is obviously more powerful than his underling, all of Earth is directly in danger, and a god is seemingly about as high as it goes. So how do you establish this new threat as bigger than that without generic DBZ power creep? Have them go to Earthrealm and kill Liu Kang as well. This changes everything. Liu Kang is the hero who bested every previous threat. Not only is this establishing the two as a bigger threat than any before, as they've beaten the man who has always pulled through for Earthrealm, but this is not setting up Liu Kang's training journey to pull back ahead. Shang Tsung takes his soul, meaning that he cannot be brought back until Shang Tsung is dead, and the two sorcerers have just taken out the one man we know can defeat him, the best Earthrealm has to offer, so someone else now needs to really pull out all the stops to rise above even those who defeated Earthrealm's best. And while the game doesn't really have a lead protagonist like every other entry fairly clearly has, I believe this is where Kung Lao is meant to take centre stage. But I'll come back to that later when we discuss the roster. But the takeaway here is that Liu Kang's death meant something. As the hero who always beat the final bosses, taking him out of the picture would make the new villains a threat even if he just died of a heart attack, because Earth's best fighter is now gone. Compare that with MK9 killing him and having him become an evil revenant working for the villains in the two subsequent games, but then never letting him win a fight or pose a threat again, and you can see why this original death is so much more impactful and does so much more for the narrative than the completely bungled attempt at the same a decade later. To end the intro, the sorcerers begin their plot to revive the undead army, and Raiden gathers what remains of Earth's forces to lead them to Outworld to fight the sorcerers.
We must act now. We must stop this deadly alliance.
Fantastic line to end the intro on, starting a trend where each intro ends with a title drop for the rest of the trilogy. However, I always read this line as Raiden just calling them an alliance that is deadly, but elsewhere in the game the name is used officially, suggesting it is actually what the sorcerers call themselves, which does make them a little harder to take seriously. With our core premise established, our next port of call is the character bios. I've never known a game other than this and Deception to give characters two bios, which are really one bio split into two parts. Each is accompanied by a render of the character in each of their two costumes, which is fun. And indeed, everyone getting two distinct costumes instead of just an alternate colour is also fun. These bios are mostly focused on what the character's been up to recently if they're a veteran. Kano, for example, had not been seen since MK3. Sonya said he was dead in MK4, so the game needed to explain why Sonya thought he was dead, why he actually wasn't, and what he'd been up to in the meantime, in addition to what his role in this story is, and two bio screens just isn't enough room to do it all. And that's where Conquest mode comes in. Before it was a full-fledged adventure mode, Conquest debuted here as a tutorial mode, having you play a series of 10 missions per character. These missions are used to split the various aspects of play into segments so the player can leave and come back. Each is also accompanied by historical information about the fighting style or weapon they're learning, as well as the character's personal history, giving such details as in which movie Johnny Cage used certain moves, and what the character was up to prior to the time frame of the game's plot, such as how Kano survived his supposed death, and what led from there to him being Shao Kahn's general, and then an enforcer for the sorcerers. And then we have the Crypt Renders, a series of special artworks that are used to expand the lore of the game and series with brief text explanations. All of this is used to really flesh out the MK universe with new factions and realms and previously unknown backstory details. Among these are the Red Dragon, a clan that the Black Dragon founders were originally from, similar to the Lin Kuei and Shirai-Ryu, the reason for Reptile's de-evolution since UMK3, the Oni denizens of the Netherrealm, some of the tournament's rules for once, and a race of vampires whose realm was subjugated by Outworld eons ago. It really made the game feel like it was ushering in this new era for the franchise, and also makes one feel nostalgic for this era when the modern series has ignored damn near all of this in favour of MK 1-4 editions only. It just goes to show that you can tell a good story with text blurbs, and that big fancy cinematic stories aren't automatically better just because they're like movies. And in many ways, those cinematics actually limit the scope of the narrative. Can you imagine trying to force cinematic fights onto Natara and Cyrax travelling outworld beyond throwing Reptile and random jobbers at them a dozen times? Or forcing playable fighters into the Deadly Alliance's tournament for Li Mei to fight when they don't belong in that plot? These smaller stories aren't really possible with the modern style, and it helps the characters and the games themselves stand out by not trying to force every plotline to be part of the main story. It's cool when fighting game characters can just have their own things going on at the same time as the major events. It makes the setting feel bigger and more alive. And the final piece of the game's narrative is the character endings. Each character's ending follows the classic style of artwork with text explanations, but are now narrated by Raiden, including his own. I have to wonder if this approach may be what inspired the team to have the bios be told in first person in Deception, because there is so much more character to narration delivered by an entity within the story's world than some nameless nobody. It's not just flatly explaining the events, you have the opportunity to have the character's viewpoint delivered. Granted, this isn't done much outside of Raiden's ending, but the potential is there, as proven by Injustice 2 and MK11 running with the idea for their own endings. Naturally, the endings are all just theoretically canonical, aside from the villains winning obviously, until the next game releases, but even endings that were obviously non-canon could have some interesting concepts, such as Liu Kang possessing Kano's lifeless body in Quan Chi's ending, or Sonya becoming a general. Overall though, they are about what one would expect from an ending in this style, and to an extent, the same can be said of the roster. Despite what a bold new direction the game took with its storyline, storytelling, and gameplay style, the roster is actually a fairly standard one. Liu Kang aside, the roster has pretty much everyone you'd expect to see here. Scorpion, Sub-Zero, Raiden, Johnny Cage, Sonya Blade, Jax, Kitana, Kung Lao, Reptile, Kano, and not a single character introduced in MK4 save for Quan Chi. While this has become a point of contention for me in the Netherrealm era, this is completely understandable and justifiable here. As mentioned, this game was the series' big relaunch, aiming to win back fans that had been losing faith in the brand following the lackluster movie and game sequels of the late 90s. As such, having basically everyone the fans would want and expect is a good first step to winning them back, an excuse that does not exist when the series is generally being received well. Second, the game was doing a lot to shake things up with both its story and gameplay, so having as much familiarity as possible helps to soften the blow, and it's something a lot of other big overhaul sequels could do with learning from. Plus, with the gameplay overhauls, fans would naturally want to see how the series' iconic cast would play in this style, so letting them get their hands on so many of them up front was probably a good idea. But even then, the game doesn't rely too heavily on old faces as most fighting games do these days. Of the 24 fighters, bonus and boss characters included, 11 are brand new, and even those that return are allowed to change and develop, beginning the era of distinguishing the palette swaps that accounted for around half of the series' cast before this. So let's talk about the cast. As stated, the game doesn't strictly have a lead protagonist here, but Kung Lao does fit the bill with his personal story. He's Liu Kang's closest friend currently. He's the one Shang Tsung poses as to get close to him. He's the one who found his body. He's the one training under the guy who taught Liu Kang the move he used to beat Shang Tsung to learn a new move to defeat the sorcerer. His ending is all about him avenging Liu Kang and putting his soul to rest. And if he kills Shang Tsung, he'll also be freeing the soul of his ancestor, essentially completing his own series-long arc in the process. And I think that this build-up, coupled with the tragedy of him and the others being killed in the end as we learn next time, is where the idea of Kung Lao being a second-rate Liu Kang ultimately started, since he can't beat Shang Tsung even with a sister move to the move Liu Kang used to beat Shang Tsung, so it makes Kung Lao look inferior. Next, of course, we have the two sorcerers. Quan Chi's story is a fine continuation from the last game, utilising the amulet he was revealed to have stolen from Shinnok in a non-canon ending as a key plot element. It's a good way to firmly canonise that idea and serves as a narrative through line from MK4 to here. Shang Tsung finally has a cool look for his younger self, and that's about it. I think emphasising how many times Liu Kang failed to kill him would have added dramatic irony to him finally avenging himself on the champion, but alas, Raiden has returned from his stint as an Elder God because he hates the constraints they place on themselves when it comes to interfering with the affairs of the realms. It's a solid foundation for what could be done with Dark Raiden in the sequels. I love that defiant and proactive aspect of his character, but really, he shouldn't have even been in this game. But that's for later. Our newcomers begin with Bo Rai Cho, the man who trained Liu Kang but was unable to compete in the tournaments because, as an Outworlder, his victory would have been for Outworld. That's a great reason for a guy who is theoretically just as good as Liu Kang to not fight before now. And to call back to something I said earlier, you occasionally see people who claim that Bo Rai Cho was based on a character from MK Conquest, Master Cho, just because he's a martial arts master named Cho, and clearly that's not the case. Master Cho is a life-stealing bastard, while Bo Rai Cho is one of the most noble characters in the series, and is based on very specific archetypes, to the point that his name, Bo Rai Cho, comes from the Spanish word borracho, which means drunk, because he is the old master, fat guy, and drunken master archetypes all in one. The Cho thing is just a coincidence. Get out of here with that stupid shit. Early on, Bo Rai Cho was mostly used for fat, fart, and alky jokes, which made a lot of people hate him. I never got why it was so extreme. Against quite a few other characters in this series, he's at least memorable. All of these traits were toned down in MKX to make a more respectable take on him without disregarding his entire identity. Good job, MKX! Sub-Zero is now a mentor too, having overthrown Sector to reform the Lin Kuei and become more powerful than ever. Alongside a cool new aesthetic, he also has a new apprentice. The so-called female Sub-Zero, Frost is the roster's representation of this new Lin Kuei as a whole. Her presence here cements Sub-Zero's new status quo all by itself. Her ice powers function differently from Sub-Zero's to highlight the difference in their power levels and experience, and she has enough of her own style to stand out from her mentor. She also represents the hesitant setup for a new generation, taking over for Liu Kang and Raiden's successors. Making her turn out to be evil was a good idea, but little has ever been done to expand on the idea since. I would have called back to the Sub-Zeros having a sister left in America in mythologies, whether it really is her or not, but she's sadly never been given much depth or identity beyond what she debuted with, which wasn't much. Li Mei is the rare Outworlder who doesn't work for the bad guys. She stars in a completely standalone plotline here. The sorcerers have set up a tournament for the people of her village to harvest their souls for the undefeatable army. She serves to explore the impact the villains have on the people of Outworld, used as fodder for the villainous scheme of the day and needing someone to rise up and save them. That's what she aims to do, and there's potential for this origin story to create either a champion or a survivor. Only time would tell which. And yeah, while minimal, her role as a leader for her people in MKX was a natural development for her character either way, but it would have been better if a plot like this had happened in that timeline too to lead into it. Scorpion is still Scorpion. This game is really just a stopgap between him learning the truth about his clan's demise and becoming champion of the Elder Gods. Cool designs though, and it's the dawn of his swordsman phase. Dramin and the unplayable Moloch are denizens of the Netherrealm, expanding on that realm's presence in the series, since the only characters from there before now were a dead man from Earthrealm, a fallen Elder God, and Quan Chi and his assassins. So human, or basically human. These guys stand out more, and yes, Dramin is originally from another realm, but he highlights how the Netherrealm can corrupt a person who lacks a drive to leave the realm like Scorpion. Their designs aren't amazing, but they work as a statement for what can be done now that live action feasibility is no longer a concern. Katana's story continues on from MK Gold, where she formed an alliance with Goro. Goro was killed in this game. I wonder if the team doubted they'd be able to mocap him and so killed him off. And then Katana's war with Shao Kahn is disrupted by the Alliance, who also killed the man she is finally properly confirmed to be in love with. No complaints here, this is the basic standard for what returning characters should expect. Kenshi is by far the most popular newcomer here, being one of only 6 characters to appear in all 3 games in the 3D trilogy, and even appearing in 2 of the 3 Netherrealm games before dying in MK11's crypt. Sadly, he's also had little done with him since. He's a lone wolf, using others to achieve his goals, but then seems to begin opening up to the idea of comrades next time. His modern counterpart quips in the intros and has no personality or victories in the story. Sonya and Jax haven't really changed much. The Outer Worlds Investigation Agency comes up again and has expanded its operations a bit, but these two clearly weren't included because the team had cool new ideas for them. They're just here because they're expected to be. Kano, meanwhile, is here to prove he's not dead and explain where he's been. But since he was presumed dead before this anyway, one can easily say he's here out of obligation too. Johnny Cage has also not developed much aside from taking a few ideas from the original movie, where his career is in a slump and he needs fresh inspiration to bring it back. Cyrax is now working with the OIA, having moved on from the Lin Kuei, and it's so satisfying to see. Him being separated from those who helped him for the entire game is a shame, but he ultimately contributes more than them thanks to Nitara. Reptile also contributes more as a result of Nitara, but coming off of MK4 where he dies in his own ending, it's a shame to see him stumble into another cruel fate and for this one to actually be canon. Still, at least he has a bit more going on than working for the bad guy or just trying to revive his dead race for once. Nitara herself introduces a whole new realm and race. Vampires exist and originate in a previously unmentioned realm named Vaeternus. Her being the centre of the most significant side plot in the game is really cool, and how much it sets up is even cooler. It's just a shame she and her realm got very little exploration beyond this. And she's somehow one of the very few characters from this era to appear in the movies and be given nothing to do because she's just seen as a setup for the Leo meme, thanks guys. Mavado and Su Hao are Red Dragon members, serving as more rivals for Kano. They are easily the least interesting newcomers in the game, both as characters and for what they add to the setting. But even so, the amount of hate they get from people who probably never even played the 3D games is absurd. They've essentially become memeified into the scrappy doos of the series, only acknowledged to be dunked on to appease dipshits who think putting Su Hao at the top of the worst MK characters list is a substitute for a personality, instead of actually doing something new to make them better characters, because most MK creatives are creatively bankrupt cowards. There are 2 bonus characters as well. Mocap is just a tribute character that people take way too seriously, while Blaze is a nod to the Pit 2 and is only important after this game. People get unreasonably mad about Blaze 2, and I have no idea why, when he actually has a narrative arc that is seen to completion, unlike most of the modern newcomers who get a free pass. I discussed it in a dedicated Wasted Potential, but it's really weird that Fujin and Kai didn't come back. Fujin replaced Raiden as Protector of Earthrealm and Kai is Liu Kang's apprentice, but Fujin fails to stop Liu Kang's death and Kai fails to show up to avenge him. Concept art reveals that Kai was planned but didn't make the cut for whatever reason, and with Raiden having his staff back after giving it to Kai in MK4, it's like they were trying to pretend the two didn't exist anymore. On the subject of cut characters, unlockable concept art showcases a few of them. Dairu from Deception was originally designed for this game. As you can imagine, without the Order Realm introduced yet, his story was entirely different. There was a lizard man named Tiamat that got cut. Maybe he was meant to relate to the Dragon King stuff, or some of the Saurian heritage introduced in this game. There's a kendo fighter named Hachiman, an elder demon named Baphomet, which is probably the most direct translation of a figure whose name is used in the series, and some very basic martial arts movie archetypes that didn't get very far. We can also view concept art for characters who did make the cut, the most substantial being Blaze, seemingly designed to more closely resemble the Pit 2 guy who inspired him but cannot be him due to story reasons, and that one guy who got unreasonably upset that I said that just because the dev said it's Blaze can officially get fucked, because people can be wrong about their own stories, like when J.K. Rowling said Hermione was never described as white when there's a passage that directly calls her face white, or when the creator of Fate said that Artoria, the female equivalent of Arthur, is actually Altria. It can happen, and often does with MK. Fuck you. Also, there were a couple of stages that got cut and wound up in the GBA port. That's always fun to see. It's a shame the studio stage didn't make it though. The cast here is not neatly split into the good guys and the bad guys in a single plot. There is so much going on with interplay between various factions and smaller groups off doing their own thing, and interpersonal relationships that get in the way of the plot they're part of. For one, Kano and the Red Dragon are both aligned with the 2 sorcerers, Red with Quan Chi and Kano with his old pal Shang Tsung, both sorcerers trying to stack the deck in their favour to give themselves the edge when they inevitably turn on each other, and also offering a shot at the other group to their respective ally. Sub-boss Moloch and his partner Dramin, who protected Quan Chi from Scorpion in return for an escape from the Netherrealm that Quan Chi reneged on, are now working with Shang Tsung as a secret weapon against Quan Chi, but are also still enemies of Scorpion despite the three's mutual nemesis, and this small overlapping narrative is what sets up Scorpion's plotline for the next 2 games when they only try to kill him. Nitara the vampire is trying to restore her realm, so she manipulates Reptile into attacking Cyrax when he comes to recon an area in Outworld prior to Raiden gathering his forces, stranding Cyrax and leading to Kenshi being hired by the Outerworld Investigation Agency to go to Outworld and find him, but he's just using the OIA to get access to Outworld to seek revenge on Shang Tsung for the sorcerer stealing the souls of his ancestors long ago. And then Su Hao destroys the OIA's portal device, stopping them from sending anyone else, setting up a beef with Jax and forcing Raiden to take his group to another portal to get to Outworld, probably buying Frost time to plot her betrayal of Sub-Zero. And Nitara, during all this, abandons Reptile because she was only using him to get Cyrax's durable cyborg armor to brave the molten lava where the sphere that can release her realm from Outworld is kept, and then honouring that deal because she's not just a manipulator, and then Reptile arrives just too late, but this is the chamber where a dragon egg is being kept, leading to the Dragon King's return to be the boss in the next game, and also the bonus character Blaze is here, and this sets up his role as the boss in the game after that. Some people might find this vast web of interconnecting narratives and long-term setups to be too complicated, which would explain why the conflicts got a lot simpler, starting with Shaolin monks, with rarely more than 2 factions being involved, and with very little betrayal between villains or unique goals beyond defeating the other side. But to me, this makes the plot feel so much more interesting, with so many plot lines intersecting and feeling less divided, but without boiling everything down to 2 factions. Compare this to MK11 where the villains are in a big alliance but they rarely interact between groups. Shao Kahn, the Black Dragon, the Lin Kuei, they're all very firmly set as distinct factions with distinct episodic plot lines that have no bearing on one another and only serve to divide the heroes into small groups, which are also firmly segmented by pre-established dynamics. I much prefer what Deadly Alliance and Deception were doing, and it's a real shame that we lost that soon after. My only real gripe with the roster is that Quan Chi and Shang Tsung are just normal enemies you fight at the end of an arcade run. They're not a duo like Noob Smoke nor an endurance match, but two normal fights presented in a random order after defeating Moloch. While I'm glad the series was moving away from the insufferably difficult arcade bosses, I think that the idea of a pair of equals as the main villains could have been better utilised from a gameplay standpoint. Keeping them apart makes them feel less like a duo and more like two separate factions that the heroes have to beat to win, like this was MK11. And in terms of gameplay, they're just normal enemies with nothing unique about them. It's kind of like how Shinnok in MK4 was nothing special while Goro, the sub-boss, was the real threat. By which I of course mean Moloch can fuck right off. He's the real challenge of the arcade run. Fortunately, I found a very easy exploit back in the day where you have Raiden whip out his staff and just spam his 2-hit swing, which Moloch seems to have a lot of trouble countering. And since the challenge is in the sub-boss instead of the final boss, you can just switch to Raiden once you reach him, kill him, and switch back in the next fight. It's great. Now that we're done with the characters, let's discuss the arenas they fight in. The game is actually quite notable for its stage offerings, being the last entry to not bring back any previous stages in the series, as every single game after this would have at least one, if we account for MKX's single DLC stage. The closest is the Nethership, the vessel that ferried the fighters to the island back in the MK1 prequel comic. Of course, this makes sense, given the inherently different way this game's arenas were designed to take advantage of the new extra dimension, but it's not like it's even difficult to do, given how MK4 brought back Goro's Lair and the Living Forest in 3D. I imagine it was primarily to give the series a fresh start in regards to locales, or perhaps a desire to try and keep the stage options mostly relevant to the narrative of this game. Most of them are given a lore explanation for their presence, such as the Nethership and Portal arenas being part of how Raiden gets his fighters to Outworld, or the Dragonfly that they use to traverse Outworld. Even those not related to the fight with the sorcerers have some significance, such as an arena near the Lin Kuei Temple where Sub-Zero likely trains Frost, the Wuxi Academy arena where Liu Kang died and Bo Rai Cho presumably trains Kung Lao, the House of Pakara where Kenshi's backstory takes place, and the Dragon Egg Chamber where Onaga will make his return. There are maybe 3 stages with no real plot relevance at all, and I think this helps to give the plot a bit more of an identity, as it helps to map out the journey and further detail the narrative being woven across so many disparate elements of the game. Think about it. You are being told the story as you read descriptions of arenas and map out a chronology in your head. That is so fucking cool. Obviously, modern entries with the cinematic story modes don't need to do this, but it's a shame Deception and Armageddon didn't do the same, especially the latter where only 2 main game arenas are even part of the story. And the final topic here is the environmental interaction the game introduced. Prior to this, the only gameplay difference the arena had was the handful of stage transitions in MK3 and the occasional rock you could throw in MK4. What Deadly Alliance introduces is fairly rudimentary, but it is there. Basically, the arenas are circles with a force field around the outside to keep the fighters in. But some arenas have breakable objects scattered around, like the icicles at the Lin Kuei Temple and the pillars in Moloch's Lair. And then we have the acid-spewing statues at the acid bath that damage fighters in range automatically. Details like these help to make these arenas feel distinct and not just like the same map but with a different aesthetic. It's an area the next 2 games would substantially build upon, but it's pretty minor in this game. My only real gripe here is the lack of stage fatalities. Like, you have an acid bath right there. Why even bother if you won't let me throw Quan Chi into it? I think he canonically does that to Scorpion. And with the arenas done, let's discuss what actually happens in these places. As with many leaps to a new generation, the series overhauled its core gameplay for this title. The most obvious change is the shift to full 3D movement, building on the 3D environments and occasional use of stage depth from MK4. And just to get this out there, the NetherRealm games are not 2.5D just because they have 2D gameplay and 3D graphics. That's a stupid way to categorize it. 2.5D should be for games with an element of spatial depth, but not one that is fully traversable like MK4. So, with full 3D movement, the series placed far less emphasis on special moves since projectiles and the like can now be easily sidestepped, forcing players to time their use better and learn more of the character's moveset. You'd think this would be welcomed openly by the hardcore player base and that it would be the casuals who rely on projectiles to get by that would hate it, but it almost seems to be the opposite. Another way the game de-emphasises special moves is with fully fleshed out movesets, moving away from the universal normals of previous games. Now everybody has a unique set of moves and combos that make everyone feel distinct in a way that they never had before, since the only thing separating, say, Scorpion and Sub-Zero previously was that Scorpion had the spear and teleport and Sub-Zero had the ice ball and slide. On the subject of specials, a number of iconic specials are unfortunately missing here, such as Scorpion's teleports, or Sonya's energy rings and leg grapples. This is a problem for longtime fans, which would fortunately be rectified by the sequels. The other big new addition is the style switching mechanic. That's right, you thought switching styles on the fly in Devil May Cry 4 was cool? Well, back in 2002, MK already had you switching between 3 styles and they all kicked ass. Essentially, everyone gets 2 martial arts and a melee weapon, building on the weapon system from MK4 where you could pull one out. Those weapons had very limited movesets as the trade-off for higher damage. Here though, they have fully fleshed out movesets of their own, with higher damage taken in return for higher damage dealt. Some movesets have a lot of overlap, such as Scorpion and Kenshi's swords, but overall, everyone does feel very distinct with these styles, and the ability to seamlessly switch to the next style through branching combos is cool. There are no branch combos going from the weapon back to the first style though, but that's fine. One minor issue though is that there's no real logic to who is given what style. Some make sense, like Shang Tsung having Snake because he's like a serpent himself and that was his animality in MK3, but why Crane? Wouldn't that have perhaps fit Johnny Cage better as a nod to the Karate Kid to go with his Jeet Kune Do style to reflect his Hollywood background? Or why does Cyrax have ninjutsu when the Lin Kuei are supposedly not ninjas? And why do Outworlders, Edenians etc. use Earthrealm martial arts? Does anyone else find that weird? Clearly the team were enthusiastic about the potential to accurately portray real-life martial arts, given the extensive use of motion capture to more faithfully capture the movements, the history lessons and breakdowns of the styles featured through the Conquest mode text, and the inclusion of a brand new character inspired by the man who portrayed these styles through the motion capture, Mocap, based on Carlos Pacina, who was also the original Raiden from MK1 and 2. Sadly, not every style is portrayed accurately. Baji Chuan is a good example, being a lot more floaty and soft than the high impact thrust the style is supposed to have. That's the only example I know of personally, but I imagine with 42 styles on offer and like 8 people working on the animation, some amount of inaccuracy is bound to slip through. How much this affects your enjoyment is going to depend on how much you know about each style, I guess. Essentially, watching style select will make you dislike Li Mei's style. The only other thing I can think of to add about the gameplay is that I really like the Impale move, where you can sacrifice your weapon for the rest of the round to deal damage over time. It's not only cool to see, but it has tactical value as you weigh up the benefits of having the weapon's greater damage output versus ensuring a constant stream of damage alongside your own, weaker hand-to-hand attacks. Also, you may have noticed here that Blaze has orange blood. Yeah, back when the games would include unique blood colours just for a secret bonus fighter who is brand new, and thus could have just had one of the existing other 3 blood colours the game has to offer. Get fucked, MK11! Now that we have core gameplay covered, let's discuss how said gameplay ends. For the only other time in the series outside of MK1, each character is given only one finisher each. This makes the stinkers stand out, and yes, some of them are quite bad. People like to dunk on Quan Chi's awful fatality for being, well, awful, and they are right to, but it's become one of those common dunking points used by the terminally unimaginative like hated on Su Hao, to the point that the move is at least memorable, unlike the dozens of overly long, needlessly brutal and detailed finishers of the modern games. It's like how MK Annihilation is bad in a fun, memorable way, while 2021 is bad and just kind of boring. The real issue with finishes in this game is how the animation can be a bit clunky and awkward. Some of this is forgivable for being the second time the team were using this technology for MK, but it's still worthy of criticism. As for everyone only having one finisher, I don't really care too much. It's not like the game incentivizes the use of finishers at all, unlike some other entries, so variety isn't exactly a priority. But there are some winners, like Kenshi breaking the opponent's bones with telekinesis, or Scorpion actually using his spear for the first time. Overall though, this game has some of the weakest finishes in the series, but they're over quickly, so I'll still take them over what we have nowadays. One of the new additions here is how, when switching from one style to another, you get the Fatality style, which just locks you in place to help you with the Fatality input, but the face buttons still do attacks, so you can easily fail the input because you didn't have the right timing, so the character just kicks the opponent. But at least if you put some distance between you and the opponent, it shouldn't cause too much of a problem, and that leads into one of the best things about Fatalities in this era. There are no distance requirements since the camera is going to cut to a new angle anyway, so they can use that to mask the blatant repositioning. This is something the modern games have yet to realise. As usual, you have those funny moments and oddities, like Reptile's acid spit stunning an already faceless Scorpion by just putting out his flames, Reptile having a human skeleton that looks nothing like his new reptilian body would imply, or Scorpion having a skull within his flaming skull. But despite these oversights, we still have a clear attention to detail in other instances. Scorpion's skull flame goes out when he gets frozen. Kenshi's fatality opens with him popping the opponent's eyes out. Kano only has one eye, so only one comes out. Jack, Cyrax, Johnny and Kenshi usually cover theirs, so theirs don't come out. Likewise, Sonya's Kiss of Death move, which even affects Johnny Cage, has no effect on Kenshi.
Blindness has its benefits.
It's like how Kenshi will use his ears and test your sight since he's blind. And speaking of the minigames, This game marks the point where additional modes were becoming a priority for the series. While not being at the point of having full-on alternative modes like its two sequels, this game brought back Test Your Might from MK1, now with the option to choose how often it comes up in an arcade run and being more complex with more difficult objects to break each time you're successful. Alongside this came the new Test Your Sight, where you follow some cups to identify where the object ended up. It's simple, but it also has more difficulty levels with more cups and higher speeds. And both of these are playable in 2-player too. It's not a lot, but it's a sign of where the team was willing to go to add more variety to the games after the previous entries had normal play and maybe a tag mode. But the bigger, more substantial addition in this game was the Crypt, a place where coins earned in gameplay can be spent to unlock all sorts of things from concept art to bios to lore to gag renders to characters and costumes. And with 676 coffins to open, you'll be at this for a very long time. Unfortunately, without much variety of modes to play and no online functionality, this is quite excessive to the point where you'll need to do every character's conquest mode and arcade runs multiple times over to get them all, which is helped a bit by the ability to wager coins with other profiles in versus mode, which is how I always got more coins outside of non-stop arcade runs, because you can't reset progress in conquest mode. How am I only now learning about this? You can see how Deception reducing the scale and having more modes to earn coins in was a massive benefit for the Crypt. Honestly, I don't think it would have been such a core fixture of the series since without that refinement. Still, I'll give it this. It has the best atmosphere of any Crypt in the series. Everything has a preset location so you can focus on what you want if you know where it is, instead of praying to the RNG Elder Gods that you won't just get a worthless augment. And the only bullshit it has are the empty coffins, and when you unlock a costume for a character you don't have. I think it would have been better if instead of the character being in the Crypt, it was the costumes, and obtaining one lets you use the character in it. And all of this content is available under the content menu, where you can also rewatch endings and also watch some behind the scenes content like the History of Mortal Kombat video that always cracks me up. Only the core series and the 2 movies are mentioned, and Ed Boon's commentary on the movie says it all.
It was around this time that Hollywood smelled box office potential in the franchise.
We were very happy with the first film.
In 1997, Hollywood produced a second feature film.
And he just doesn't say anything about Annihilation at all. Classic Ed. You can also obtain the full MK1 prequel comic page by page and read it. Great inclusion for someone new to the series like me, and the rare occurrence of MK actually celebrating an anniversary. And finally, we have the music video for Immortal by Edema, which has footage from the game's cinematic trailers and also has the band performing in Deadly Alliance locales. And at the end, the band all surround Scorpion and he's like, damn bro, finna need to bust out the spear to deal with these guys. Fucking sick, bro. If this shit ain't your jam, you're not a real MK fan, I'm sorry. And did you know Edema is still going? Bring them back for the next game's launch trailer, you fucks. They did the same later with Cold's With My Mind for Psyops, and I wish they'd kept it going. Why can't modern MK have cool stuff like this to unlock? Now I suppose we should briefly discuss the GBA ports before we enter the final segment. Deadly Alliance was the first good portable MK release. There are a few videos on the subject, so go watch those to see just how bad it was until this. The game was actually pretty faithful, retaining the 3D movement and style switching from its console counterpart. Where it had to cut corners then was the roster. It was cut down to only 12 fighters, even axing Raiden and Johnny Cage. And sadly, the high number of weird alternate colour palettes didn't really make up for that, so this called for an alternate version. Not an enhanced version, this is no Ultimate MKDA. Mortal Kombat Tournament Edition, presumably named for the Malibu comics, is an alternate release with the same gameplay and features, but with the entire roster from the other ports axed, aside from Scorpion and the Sorcerers, in favour of the rest of the cast, making for one of only 2 ever MK releases without Sub-Zero. Alongside those restored characters came 3 newcomers: Sector, Noob Saibot, and the playable debut of Serena from Mythologies. So I guess we technically did have a Sub-Zero here. Largely built on top of existing characters, the main draw for the 3 is their endings, which advance their personal stories and reveal who killed Goro in Kitana's story. I'd love to see a ROM hack with all the content in a single title. In terms of presentation, aside from the obvious visual and audio hits such a port requires and the low number of buttons on the GBA, the game also lacks on the intro, instead transcribing Raiden's narration into a huge wall of text with no screenshots and not even tweaked for brevity. Not the best way to convey the narrative, I must say. And the ending art is much smaller now, meaning we don't have high resolution versions of the TE editions, but we do still have both images for each character's endings, so they managed to pull through there at least. They even brought over the Fatalities, albeit without the dismemberment, and Tournament Edition introduced a new finisher type, Weapon Fatalities, where the character just does a basic combo string that kills the opponent. I don't have footage of my own though, because they have to be unlocked in the crypt and Serena's cost 2,000 gold, so fuck that. And there's really not much else to say about this version. If you wanted the game on the go, I suppose this wouldn't be a bad option. It's a shame it never got a PSP port like Deception. Bringing over the Armageddon versions of Noob, Sector and Serena as previews could have been a really cool bonus, and should absolutely be done in any future ports that will never happen because fighting game preservation doesn't exist. But even if the game's owners refuse to keep it alive, I'm not going to let it die. So let me tell you what Deadly Alliance means to me. Deadly Alliance was the game that got me into MK. I'd played MK4 briefly and then MK Gold a fair bit, but Gold was just a game I liked and that was the end of it. It didn't inspire me to seek out more entries in the series. Then, one day in 2002 or 3, I saw Deadly Alliance for 20 quid. I'd liked Gold well enough, and seeing the next MK on Xbox for half a full price, I went for it. The gameplay was so much more complex with truly unique movesets and full 3D movement. I've never been that much of a fan of classic MK gameplay, so this game was a massive improvement for me. It built on ideas introduced in MK4 and truly brought the series into a new era. And even if I couldn't fully appreciate the implications of Liu Kang and Shao Kahn's deaths at the time, there was so much lore here, so many moving parts to the narrative that even someone largely unfamiliar with the series' story could appreciate how much work went into fleshing out this universe and its cast. An appreciation that has only grown with time thanks to my expanding knowledge of what came before and the unfortunately shrinking scope of the setting and story in the modern era. And so I finished the arcade mode, I completed Conquest, I cleared out the crypt and I eagerly awaited what Midway had in store for me in the next game. And I played as Scorpion in Psyops and Raiden in Unreal to hold me over until Midway were ready to steal my heart forever. It may not be my favourite MK, Deception will likely always hold that title, but I'd definitely put it in the top 3 of the main series, probably just slightly behind Armageddon. Deadly Alliance was a fantastic starting point for the 3D era and made the series feel like more than just a generic rival to Street Fighter that got by mostly on its gore. In fact, having the option to turn the blood off entirely in this game feels less like a concession for those people, and more like a ballsy proclamation that the series was ready to stand on its gameplay as a truly unique fighter that was only going to get better with time. And that, my friends, is what Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance means to me. It took quite a while to lay it all out there, but all this to say, this video had better do fucking numbers after all the times people have said they want me to talk about games I like, because if it doesn't, I am never listening to you guys again. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended videos are my critiques of the NetherRealm trilogy, just to provide a little contrast between how good the 3D era actually was, and how much of a massive downturn the series took afterwards.